Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to our webinar on UK AI regulation. This is part of our monthly policy hour series. And as some of our audience members know, and for those of you who are new to our policy hour series, we here at Holistic AI are an AI governance, risk management, compliance company. And we grew from the UCL computer science department and combined academic research with industry experience to create a scalable solution to ensure that AI is safer and fairer through risk mapping, through risk mitigation, auditing, and assurance. And so I'm here, Monica, a senior policy expert at Holistic, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. I'm also joined by my colleague here, Sid. And Sid, if you could just say one or two words about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Monica. Hi, everyone. I'm Sid, and I'm a Policy and Governance Associate with Holistic AI.
And of course, we are joined with our guest, Akir, who is head of tech regulation at the Startup Coalition. So, Akir, if you can just say one or two words about yourself as well.
Hi, thank you. I'm actually an alum of UCL, so really glad to be here and have a part in this conversation.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Sid at the moment. So the floor is yours to begin our discussion.
Thanks, Monica. Our webinar today will be focused on the UK's approach to AI regulation, particularly the white paper on the intended pro-innovation approach that was released in March earlier this year. To give some background, the UK vision for AI governance really is founded on 4 principles, which are number 1, open, which is to say that AI should support freedom and democracy; responsibility, which is that AI should be consistent with the rule of law and human rights; secure, AI should be safe and predictable by design, safeguarding property rights, privacy, and national security; and finally, resilience, where AI should be trusted by the public and critical systems embedded with AI must be protected. Next slide, please. Before we really begin our conversation with Kier today, we're going to set up the scene a bit and provide a little bit of context. As a lot of us here are aware, the UK government has yet to propose any legislation on artificial intelligence, which is very unlike other regions like the US and the EU, which have been very active with legislations like the Algorithmic Accountability Act or the EU AI Act for that matter. I will now give an overview of what the UK government has done in governing AI so far. The ICO, or the Information Commissioner's Office, was responsible for the first wave of activity in the UK in regards to AI regulation, with their guidance on AI auditing, explainability, and data protection, where their guidance on explainability of decisions was developed in collaboration with the Alan Turing Institute. The Department of Culture, Media and Sport, or DCMS, then started to focus on AI regulation by publishing the National Data Strategy and subsequently the National AI Strategy in collaboration with the Office for AI and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, or BASE. Subsequently, the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, or the CDEI, then published a roadmap on enabling an effective AI assurance ecosystem. DCMS, BEIS, and the Office for Artificial Intelligence then jointly released the policy paper last year on establishing a pro-innovation approach to regulating AI, which really in some ways was the precursor to the white paper that was recently published. On the 7th of February this year, it was announced that a new Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, or DCIT, had been created to support the UK's efforts to be at the forefront of science and technology innovation. Shortly after, on the 29th of March this year, DCIT, along with the Office for AI, published the white paper on the UK's pro-innovation approach to AI regulation. Next slide, please. The white paper builds on the government's national AI strategy, something that I mentioned earlier, which aims to boost skills and attract international investment in the context of AI. There are 3 objectives that really underpin the AI regulation white paper, which are to drive innovation and growth, to increase public trust in AI by addressing risks and protecting fundamental values, and to finally strengthen the UK's position as a global leader in AI. The paper proposes a sector-based approach where existing regulators in those sectors will guide and police the development and deployment of AI. Next slide, please. The white paper aims to achieve consistency with its sector-specific approach to regulating AI by establishing an overarching set of 5 principles that regulators can use across industries. These 5 principles are also very closely aligned with the text of the EU's AI Act and are, number 1, safety, security, and robustness, where AI systems should function robustly, securely, and safely throughout their life cycle, with risks monitored and managed throughout. Number 2, appropriate transparency and explainability, where there must be sufficient transparency around when and how AI is being used and for what purposes. Fairness, where AI systems should not undermine the legal rights of any individual or organization, discriminate unfairly against individuals, or create, for that matter, unfair outcomes, for example, in the areas of provision of credit, recruitment, and in insurance as well. Accountability and governance, which is to say that AI regulation should be effective and appropriate, and oversight must really be demonstrated at every age of an AI system's lifecycle. The 5th pillar is on contestability and redress, which is to say that those impacted by AI systems should be able to contest decisions that are harmful or create material risks or harm. These citizens should also be able to create redress through existing mechanisms. Additionally, the white paper looks at 6 illustrative risks that AI poses, both inside and outside of current regulatory paradigms. These are the risks to human rights, safety, fairness, privacy and agency, societal well-being, and finally, the risk to security. With this background, I'd like to hand over the conversation to Monica, who will now moderate the discussion. Monica.
Thank you, Sid, for that background. So, Keir, given what we've just heard in regards to what Sid presented about current UK government's efforts so far with AI regulation, do you have any thoughts on what these 5 principles that he just mentioned right now, for example, mean for SMEs? And to sort of give a little more background to that, specifically, since you advocate and you work on ensuring that SMEs have the necessary resources, like the finances and the talent to succeed, and you're also very much making sure that there's the right type of regulation to support innovation. How achievable do you believe that this implementation of these principles are for smaller companies that have fewer resources?
Yeah, no worries. Obviously, at the Startup Coalition, we advocate and are a voice for scale-ups and startups in the UK. So I'm always excited to talk about what they think about things like AI. I think for us, the overall approach is good. Principles over prescription is a much easier thing to handle, especially when it comes to compliance. The overall approach is forward thinking, pro-innovation, cross-sectoral, and it's adaptable. Like, that's all really good for the startup community. It's hopefully easy to comply with and flexible. But at the end of the day, this was a white paper and principles in a white paper. So I think what we're most curious for is how these are going to apply in the different sectors. And are they going to intervene on the bread and butter issues of data access, talent, and like the building blocks of startups? Or are we going to see something that doesn't necessarily tackle that or outline the outcomes in a way that supports startup and innovation? So I'm excited by them. It's a really great start, but I'm also just hoping for more, and I kind of want to see where it plays out.
So in part, you don't really think then that SMEs are at a disadvantage if indeed there are going to be efforts that will actually highlight what is necessary and purposeful for SMEs in particular?
I mean, I have never worked at a startup. I'm working with startups. So it's always very hard for me to get into the brain of founders and startup employees. I think I, like a lot of the community, are concerned about regulation that stifles our ability to operate and the basic, is this going to be too hard to comply with? As it is really broad and almost on purpose. So right now, I'm curious to see what happens next. At the end of the day, we've seen so many news headlines and changes and constant talk from the UK government on what comes next that I hope it follows in the footsteps of the white paper. And I'm really excited to see and work with on the government and startups on what that looks like. But at the end of the day, it's hard to know what comes next when everything's changing so quickly. I mean, like, it came out in the early spring and now we're in late summer and it feels like everything's changing at a pace that doesn't necessarily keep up with that.
Well, so I think this opens up really nicely to our next topic here, because we know that just recently, just this past month in June, PM Rishi Sunak, he announced that the UK will be in fact hosting an AI safety summit in early autumn. And the central objectives of that summit really include, or have been, the discussion is about making the UK really the global center for AI regulation. And by doing so, really being able to bring together an internationally coordinated series of conversations on precisely these questions of existential risks and safeguards that are necessary given where we are headed with AI technology. And in fact, the summit has been described as a chance really for leading companies and like-minded countries to come together to discuss how to limit the potential risks of the technology's rapid advancement. And from this, there's been some speculation in part that the UK wants to serve as a sort of bridge between the US and China in terms of AI regulation. And this, in fact, one could argue, is that it's a considerable change from that pro-innovation approach that was mentioned in the white paper from March. And this idea of this light touch regulation that the UK has been advancing in the past. And so, this in a way marks a shift from what PM Sunak's ongoing emphasis has been on opportunities of AI to now talking about existential risks. So given what we're seeing in that regard, do you think that there are signs that the UK might develop global relationships for AI regulation? And then how is that going to affect SMEs more precisely from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I have hay fever. So if I just suddenly lose the ability to say a word, it's because my hay fever is taking over. I think you hit the nail on the head. AI is such a big thing. And for a government that's really prided itself on being pro-tech and pro-innovation, it really is part of their political legacy. Like, this is very clearly one of the PM's big things. And that can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. And we're seeing this on play in real time. What we pride ourselves at the Startup Coalition is always injecting that startup nuance into the ecosystem. And so the fact that these conversations are going so quickly is kind of exciting for us, because now we get to inject, what do startups mean? We're starting a whole project on mapping the ecosystem and making sure all those big questions get answered. But at the end of the day, we're also equally as worried about regulatory convergence. I don't think it's absurd to say that, like, startups don't want to face competing regulatory regimes. And at the end of the day, when it comes to wanting to grow, scaling needs to be affordable. And that also talks about compliance. Like, we've got the EU's AI Act, we've got this voluntary commitment that the White House presented last week. Things are changing on a global scale every day. The UK has put itself in an incredible position with this AI Safety Summit, which was originally just an AI summit. And that's really exciting because we get to try to be the convener. And with our pro-innovation approach from the white paper, we're in a good place to, like, be competitive for startups and try to converge in a way that's broadly good for our ecosystem. I think at the end of the day, it's going to be about, does what we do make it harder for our companies to innovate or expand? And that's an ever-growing question when we can't control what everyone else is doing. And neither can the startups, but that's exactly why we're trying to get them to the table, in the conversation, in the spotlight of all of their AI, both their benefits, concerns, all of the bread and butter stuff that they're excited and worried about, to the table in the UK.
So in a way, this type of globalization, having the summit allows for SMEs to, like you say, sort of be that voice that can say, this is what we need. This is these are the problems we need to deal with. But at the same time, it really complicates the fact that there are so many different types of emerging regulatory regimes, and the changes are happening daily as we speak.
Yeah, some degree of regulatory convergence is essential. At the exact same time, maybe knowing what went wrong in other regimes is equally essential. So it's really great that we're having a summit and these conversations and bringing everyone in the ecosystem to the table here, because we have a really good shot, and maybe a narrow window, but a really good shot at getting it right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and I mean, this brings further, this point that the Competition and Markets Authority, so the CMA, the Information Commissioner's Office, ICO, and the Office of Communications formed recently the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, so the DRCF. And that was actually back in July of 2020. And the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, joined the DRCF as a full member in April of 2021. And we bring this up because the DRCF has been established to ensure a greater level of cooperation, given the unique challenges that are posed by regulation of online platforms and digital services. And specifically, that refers to promoting greater coherence where regulatory regimes intersect. The DRCF helps to resolve potential tensions, offering clarity for consumers and industry, also to be able to work collaboratively on areas of common interest and to address complex issues, and finally, to be able to work together to build the necessary capabilities, learning from what each regulator is doing, and then striving to be best in class, both now and for what comes in the future. And so, Keir, a question here for you. Regulators are going to have to work together, really, to ensure that there truly is a cohesive approach to regulation that also allows for sector specific nuances. So what guidelines from bodies like the DRCF do you think would be really useful to help SMEs and startups in general with compliance and coming up with and being in agreement with and following through with general best practices?
Yeah, I mean, this is the most exciting bit for me, because we talk to regulators each and every week, each and every day about what it means to comply in the ecosystem. And I think the DRCF is such a unique opportunity, but also each of those regulators are so aware of how they need to communicate with startups and what's at stake and what's at play, that it's exciting to see that they're trying to get this right from the get-go. As for what guidance would be useful, I think that's such a hard question, because AI is it's not necessarily sector specific. It's not necessarily cross sector just in a DRCF way. It is so dependent on sector and use case that it's so hard to say like this would be a good idea, because for some startups, they need an incredibly different set of explanations and understandings from the regulators to understand what to do next. And other ones, it's different. It's like it's the way of like medical diagnostics versus biotech versus endangered species. All of those are broadly bio-related, but have an incredibly different style of needs. And I could not claim to understand what the differences are, because my level of biology ended in high school and barely in college. I think what's clear to me is that the DRCF is a really good example of regulators coming to understand that their innovation teams and their tech teams shouldn't be siloed. And it's all about this like communication, rapid response, and ensuring that a pro-innovation perspective is embedded into the whole system. We're seeing a lot of interesting things come out of the ICO with regards to how do we best explain compliance to startups. DRCF seems to be going the same way, which is really exciting to see. And I think it is that like ad hoc advice that's going to be critical, because of how inherently dependent this is going to be on the sector, on the AI, on the tech.
Absolutely. And so, well, to continue off of that point, we know that in April of just this year, the PM and Technology Secretary, they announced a 100 million pounds in funding for the Foundation Model Task Force And this is pretty much evidence of what we're seeing here in terms of these reactive mechanisms to developments that are occurring in technology. And this particular task force is modeled on the UK's COVID-19 vaccines task force. And its purpose is to develop the safe and reliable use of this pivotal AI across the economy, and to ensure that the UK is truly globally competitive with this strategic technology, and also in developing AI for and within public services. So this, in a way, could be considered a reactive approach. Now that we know that several lawsuits are emerging relating to AI, in addition to high-profile cases of harm that we've been seeing from the use of AI without appropriate safeguards in the past. And now the UK Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, the CDE, has recently launched its portfolio of AI assurance techniques, where AI assurance is about building confidence in AI systems by measuring, by evaluating, and communicating whether an AI system meets relevant criteria that include regulation, that include standards, ethical guidelines, organizational values. And this portfolio is, in fact, similar to the OECD's catalog of tools and metrics for trustworthy AI that particularly focuses on the on impact assessments, on impact evaluation, on bias audits, on compliance, certification, conformity assessment, performance testing, and formal verification. All of this with a focus on the 5 key principles that were already mentioned on the white paper. So remember, we brought them up in terms of safety, security, and robustness, appropriate transparency and explainability, fairness, accountability, governance, contestability, and redress. And so, Keir, if you could add to this and you could tell us a bit about how a catalog like this might actually help support SMEs to take this more proactive approach to responsible AI, given that they are the ones, here in the trenches building this and working on this, and at the same time want to have that voice up there with bigger tech companies and in terms of developing these emerging regulatory regimes.
Yeah, I think what's most exciting to me about assurance techniques and the way that we're approaching them is the fact that you mentioned it, it's OECD, CDEI, like there are so many different places we're pulling guidance from that are just like internationally known or internationally used, that it's almost regulatory convergence in another way. Like it's making it easier for startups to know the state of play, not just in the UK, because we're not just using a state of play that the UK understands. So I'm really excited when it comes to things like that. I will say a lot of this is going to be really interesting to see how it plays again on the use case and sector. And I'm most excited about like the test beds and the sandboxes and the implementation that the white paper talked about with it, because I think those and the central risk function are going to be super critical on getting it not just broadly right across all of the regulators and sectors, but specifically right on what are the barriers to innovation we're not thinking about, what are the compliance risks we're not thinking about, and how do we actually navigate that when it comes to assurance techniques with businesses that are doing not the craziest things, but the most unique and like exciting things we've seen recently. I'm super excited to see how that plays out with the multi-regulator sandbox and how we're going to talk about customized advice when it comes to assurance. I don't know if that necessarily helps how it could support an SME's proactive approach, but I think all of this is helping enable proactivity in the space and helping enable conversations on what needs to come next.
Well, and you brought up right now with the regulatory sandboxes. Actually, I'd be very curious to hear if you could say a little bit more about that in terms of, does that actually help SMEs, in fact, become more competitive, precisely because it truly is a type of playground that allows for that direct interaction with policymakers, regulators, and yet allows for a lot of innovation to happen. So do you think that would give them does that give SMEs a greater level of competitive advantage in comparison to the big tech companies?
Oh, that is a hard question to answer. I will say,
just
the
thought
ethos and the idea behind it, I'm super excited by. I don't know how to say this in a way that might make sense. So I'm going to just say this how I'm feeling. When the FCA had their fintech sandbox, it was really transformative at the beginning, but now we're starting to see people worry and feel left out and feel confused by it. I think sandboxes that truly support innovation should be more than a tick boxing exercise. And I hope this multi-regulator sandbox is with it. I am most concerned, and I think rightfully so, about how we're deploying them. That in the white paper, it was kind of slowly deployed. And if we're going to talk about innovation, we're going to talk about startups, we're talking about fast moving things. The deployment of the sandbox can be rapid enough to keep pace with AI and AI's technological developments and innovation? I don't know. I hope it does, because if there's sufficient regulatory buy-in and it does create policies designed to support startups, it could be such a success like the FCA sandbox was at the beginning. But we could also see it fail. It's a really great use case, like the fintech sandbox, on good and bad and then good again.
Well, so considering that you just mentioned, and going back to this question of the catalog, so the OECD's catalog of tools and metrics, how do you think that would help SMEs be more competitive? Does it help them compete with big tech by having access to very specific tools here that otherwise they wouldn't be able to have access to?
I mean, it's important to make sure we have that injected nuance into the ecosystem, because at the end of the day, startups having these opportunities is a good thing, because it makes it so that big tech can't just decide this is how we do it and everyone else needs to listen. So having a range of solutions is really good for the ecosystem. I don't necessarily know if I can answer that question clearly, though.
Well, no, I mean, in a way, to sort of give an example, we can think of tools can be developed by startups, SMEs themselves, right? Like, for example, like AI, and we have submitted our tools to metrics catalogs, and so that it helps, and that's part of growing that ecosystem. So, do you think that could actually help with the scale up?
I think that's exactly what we're hoping for, is startup-based solutions and startups driving that conversation. Because having the opportunity to create that is inherently market changing, and it's inherently exciting.
Absolutely, and brings forward and really pushes for the innovation that we're talking about, that we really want to have moving forward. Okay, so before we wrap up and we take questions, as I'm seeing several questions come in right now, I think we can essentially safely say here that there are several points that we should highlight in regards to where the UK may be going next. And so one is that the UK and the EU approach were long cited to be different, with the UK focused on innovation and the EU on regulation. PM Rishi Sunak has made it very clear that the UK is aiming to become the global center for AI regulation. And certainly our conversation here in terms of the potential for really pushing forth and engendering innovation with SMEs highlights that as a great example. Third, the landscape will become clearer after the output, certainly, of the upcoming AI Safety Summit in the fall. However, businesses must take a proactive approach to a reactive regulatory environment. And fourth, here, final thought is that there are things to watch, also include what's happening with the online safety bill and just other sector-specific regulations, such as the new consumer duty rules. And so with that, I think this is a great moment to now take questions. And I want to first say thank you to Sid, of course, for our introduction, and to our guest here for this wonderful conversation on what's happening around UK's posture here with AI regulation and the impact it's having and that it could have on SMEs. And of course, how SMEs impact is going to be on the emerging regulation. And so now I'm going to open the floor to audience questions, which are now coming in. So just give me one moment to open that. Okay, so a question here. How can UK be made this actual global center for AI regulation in regards to the AI regulations that are occurring? So how can it actually become this center? What do you think would be needed to make it a true global center, coming from the SME's perspective?
Oh, gosh. This is a really hard question. I will say, I think the UK has got an opportunity just because we've got a really large tech sector. We've got a really large startup and scale up sector. We have the opportunity to ask and answer a lot of questions we've seen come out of the EU AI Act, answer a lot of the criticism, answer a lot of the success stories, and figure out what a practical approach to AI looks like post all of these changes from the US and the EU. And I think for us to be world's leading, it's about making sure that we're making the basics happen for our tech sector to succeed. It's about more than these large questions about generative AI. It's about talent and compute and data access and all of the things that aren't maybe as like glamorous headline wise, but are as equally as important to make sure that businesses have what they need to succeed, and also to build AI innovations that help us out in these situations. The Global AI Summit is obviously a really good place for regulatory convergence, and it's a really amazing idea. The fact that startups are in the equation with Ian Hogarth's appointment to the Foundation Models Task Force is like a nod to the greater ecosystem. But I think we need to do more. For us, what we're thinking is the startup ecosystem is a central part of the conversation for AI regulation, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure regulators, government, DCIT hears it. So we're trying to map the ecosystem, its wants and needs, and then compare what works everywhere else and what works here and what we need to do better to hopefully create that like magical not magical, but like practical middle ground.
And so how do you see, so I'm going to try here to combine multiple questions sort of because you've answered some of them already in regards to then how should we plan then this balance between risk and encouraging innovation? And you kind of stepped on that, you talked about that a bit with the regulatory sandboxes and the problems with that. And then, you covered it in terms of the catalog that was brought up. But so how do you, what should this balance be? How do you think that, what is the voice of the SMEs to ensure that there is that true balance and it's being considered moving forward?
Yeah, I don't think we have the balance figured out yet. I think that's why we're doing this mapping of the ecosystem exercise, talking to the startups, the scale ups, the what people would call SMEs. The AI age is here, and it's like a foregone conclusion that there's been a lot of AI change. How we tackle that is what comes next. I think those conversations are rapidly happening. And for us, we want to make sure that there are pro-regulatory decisions, but at the exact same time, we are acknowledging the risks and harms. But because we are the Startup Coalition, we're looking to our founders and to our startups and to the greater AI startup ecosystem, the people we talk to on what do we need to tell government to make sure we get this right. So I don't know if I have an answer on that, as much as startups will be like make or break for this, because they aren't the larger tech companies. They're not trying to entrench themselves. They're not trying to do something they're so fast moving and innovating and fast paced that we have a chance that if we put them in the conversation to really supercharge a sector, but also supercharge a sector in a way that acknowledges the risks and creates a practical middle ground. I don't know what that looks like, and I couldn't sit here and delineate it if I tried.
Well, maybe something to take it a little bit more at home and take it outside of AI regulation. What are you hearing specifically from startups about what are their perceptions on AI specifically? And it can actually be quite daunting to adopt, especially with all of these regulations that one needs to navigate, and the fact that SMEs still feel and believe, and with good reason, that their voice should be heard. So how do you think then that AI should be used in terms of in a safe way, in the right way? What are SMEs saying?
A lot of what I would say is it's about the basics. There needs to be concrete discussions on how to increase access to data, how to attract more high-skilled talent to the UK, how to secure the investment opportunities. And with all of that happening, then there's just a lot of questions and concerns and commentary on existential risk and generative AI and how we handle these things and what are actually the mitigation practices that are currently happening, because there are some really cool innovations on safety and some really cool innovations on the concrete harms that we're hearing politicians and policymakers in the headlines talk about. So we're trying to figure out what exists in the ecosystem as well. But a lot of the concerns are always bread and butter basics.
Well, and so to piggyback on that a bit, and this is actually a question that came up here, is that what is the UK's AI regulation strategies specifically for high-risk AI applications like facial recognition, emotion recognition, other types of AI-powered biometric applications? Any that?
I can say from the white paper that it seemed to be on a use case by use case basis. It was very different from the EU's definition of high risk as well. I don't know if that's changing moving forward. And I think those conversations are currently ongoing. But from the white paper itself, it seemed to be the sectoral approach made sure that it was a use case basis on risk. What that means was it was as vague as it was written.
Well, and kind of pushing this a little forward, I mean, this focus now on existential risks, and this is also another question that came up. Do you believe that that is a distraction, in fact, from the, well, first of all, from other more immediate dangers from AI, but also from actually going back to the original pro-innovation question here about, and what this means for SMEs, the effect the impact that has on SMEs?
I've heard a lot of startups tell me that this is a critical part of the conversation. I've heard a lot of startups tell me that this is something they're thinking about, but is not their main concern. I think it's important that it's part of this conversation. At what degree, that is up for the ecosystem to decide. And it's up for government to decide how much of that's going to be the conversation. It's an important part, no doubt, especially with that principle of safety, security, and robustness being part of this white paper.
Okay, and so more questions are coming in. Let me see if I can also combine a few more here. And also, of course, if you would like to add anything, and if you have any questions that you would want to add to Kier, please go ahead while I look for more here. It's quite a lot coming in, so I want to be able to combine a few.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Kier. Very illuminating discussions. I really kind of wanted to understand, I think last year the Startup Coalition did a survey on how startups are really, gauging the AI ecosystem. In terms of regulation, what are the do's and don'ts do you think, are applicable? What do you think are the definite no-nos that the UK should definitely, steer clear of?
Oh, even that's a really hard question to answer. Our survey last year, we learned quite quickly that startups have a lot of concerns with the EU's AI Act, but also that they are, let me figure out a way to say that. It's a really hard answer. They're very concerned about the basics, and they are also very concerned about regulation that makes it the regulation that could make it harder to comply or harder to understand. Our survey went through quite a lot with them. And I think what we learned most from that is that this is an ongoing conversation. We're doing another really large project to survey the ecosystem because early 2022 to now, the rate of change and the fact that consumers can now use like ChatGPT alone is a big change in the ecosystem and how we're looking at things. So for us, we learned that startups want to be the UK to be a go-to place for investment, talent, and opportunity. We've learned that there's 1,500 high growth AI startups. But we've also learned that so much has changed that we can't be complacent, and we need to continue to find the drumbeat of what AI startups want and what they think is a necessary question to ask. So we're working on that. We're going to get them, the entire AI ecosystem at the table and figure out, okay, what challenges could come next? What challenges are we currently facing? And yes, let's talk about the discussions on existential risk and how to mitigate hallucinations and deepfakes. Those are incredibly tangible and scary problems. But also, how do we hammer down the basics? So for us, our survey was such a good starting point, but it's only the beginning of a very long journey on figuring out what the UK startup ecosystem needs with regards to AI, but also what those AI startups need with regards to not AI.
Well, and this actually, we can piggyback on that just in a moment, because someone just asked the question here in terms of that you had mentioned that there is a divergence in terms of definition of what AI risk entails means. And so do you think that this adds to the burdens of compliance? How does that feed into that? And yeah, can you say a little more about that?
So the UK and the EU, and I will not claim to be a lawyer nor claim to be an expert on OECD anything. From my accent, I'm very, very American, and I live in the UK. So like everything comes with a grain of salt here. The UK and the EU both started at the same starting point of the OECD artificial intelligence divisions. When it came to how they treated AI, it changed. So the UK took that sectoral approach, which didn't focus on defining high risk in the same way that the EU did, which was very clearly, this is how we're defining high risk. These are the specific uses that are concerning. These are the specific sectors that are concerning. I think it went down by sector. That is not to say that converging there is the answer, but to say that that is an issue, is that in and of itself is a schism for startups to have to deal with later on, especially if the AI Act passes, which I don't know where it is, but it's really close to being done. And the UK, as we're building out our new approach, that's going to be a point of regulatory divide internationally. And it's going to be about figuring out, okay, is this difference okay enough to handle when we're talking about it in the global international scheme of like, is the US doing something entirely different to the UK? What about China? What about India? All of these places have radically different on the margins approaches for AI. And so for the UK, yes, that high risk use case is a really clear change, but that's not the only change we need to be worried about between different international approaches.
Well, and also, I mean, and again, this is part of another question that just came in. I mean, there's the issue that we have standards being created. We have AI risk assessments being created. We have governance frameworks being created. We have a whole multitude of options, really, of different frameworks. And so as a business and as businesses, you know, how do you see how one should handle that, how one should deal with that when there are a lot of similarities? It can be a lot of overlap, but then a lot of really smaller nuances. And especially if you're creating a product or a service, obviously that's AI enabled, that is for the global market. So how do you see dealing with that problem, with that issue ultimately? And do you think does any solution come to mind in terms of having a priority, really deciding what one should do?
If I could understand how to make that decision, I'd be a billionaire. I don't think I've got that answer. And I won't claim to do it because gosh knows that would probably cost people money if you listen to me on this. What I will say is it is clear, and it has always been clear, that startups and scale-ups and even large businesses don't want to face competing regulatory regimes. It is always harder to innovate and expand when you're talking about consistently changing definitions. You've got the patchwork of privacy in the States that all of the US startups and scale-ups and big businesses talk about as being incredibly burdensome, moving from state to state. You've got GDPR, which was an incredible hurdle for a lot of scale-ups entering the EU. You've got the online safety bill being feared for the exact same reason. And you've got a list of small to mid to large businesses being like, too much, too far. It's clear that wholly unique, wholly new compliance systems add a degree of unaffordability to scaling and to growing. And that is a really big concern. Now, how do we tackle that in a post-GDPR, post-American mishmash of laws? I don't know. If I did, I wouldn't take that to my grave. I'd be patenting that knowledge and going forth in this world.
Well, and do you think, and again, this is another question, a lot of questions are coming in. Another one here in terms of, precisely because the EU has really has a lot of headway in this and in terms of legislation, and the US in part, and that in and of itself could be its own discussion, but the UK hasn't yet proposed any legislation. So could in a way that sort of be, do you think that the UK is a step behind in that regard? Or it sort of still leaves it open for what could be done and how then that could merge into really creating harmonization across these emerging regulatory regimes to address the interoperability issue ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, we took a different approach, didn't we? In the UK, we took this pro-innovation approach to AI regulation in a white paper that said, okay, if the EU's at where they're at with the AI Act and the US is talking about an AI Bill of Rights, now the voluntary commitment, what can we do? And we took an approach that focused on the sectors, the regulators, and a sandbox, and Sir Patrick Valence's recommendations on tech. That's not nothing. And yes, we're still having these conversations, but because that's our foundation, we're a little bit more flexible, and we're in a place that's better for the ecosystem if we can bring everyone to the conversation quickly enough. At least that's my opinion, because it is a truly different take than the EU. And for a lot of reasons, that's a good thing. And maybe for a lot of reasons, that's a bad thing. But what it does mean is we've got a chance to also make some substantial change, but at a much quicker pace than I think we're giving the AI Act credit for.
Yeah, and I mean, I also think that when it comes to something as systemic as AI regulation, getting it right is probably a lot better than getting there first, which is what's happening in the US and EU. So I do think that, you know, a more sensible approach of sorts is being done. But my question is really more about, so we've been talking about governance, you know, with regards to regulation, but there's another aspect of AI governance, which is standards and standardization. And we're seeing a lot of movement in this regard in the UK with the BSI, or in the EU with, you know, CENELAC, etc., in the US as well. From the vantage point of startups and scale-ups, there are really a lot of capacity challenges when it comes to standardization. How do you think these capacity challenges and really discrepancies on the road to standardization can be resolved?
Oh gosh, that's another $1 million question. I think the white paper's layered approach to standards is interesting, and I'd be curious to see how it plays out. Standards, especially when they are not international or wholly accepted, can be quite hard to deal with. And I think the layered approach to technical standards was what? Consistency and common foundation across regulatory remits. So standards that aren't sector specific. Then it was governance practices to the specific risks of AI. So what are the new standards we need to deal with? I think in the AI white paper, they talked specifically about bias and transparency. And then you've got the sector specific technical standards to support compliance. It's possible that that's very good for and a gradual entrance into these standards, but at the exact same time, nothing's come out yet for us to be able to comment on it, or to know what's going to change there. My answer is a big I don't know.
And so again, more questions coming in. Well, here's something, you know, we're still good with some time still. So just one here that hasn't necessarily been addressed, and it's something that does come up when we address the question of safety and reliability with these systems, more on the technical side. But there's a question here in terms of what does this mean for the well-being of humans in a more abstract way, in a more from the mental, emotional, physical sense. How do you see that question of well-being figuring into the standards of safety measures? And should that be an element that should be brought in a more proactive way, especially since we know that the IEEE has certainly released a lot of documentation on this in terms of looking at well-being beyond just at the technical or a physical level, but truly that mental, at that mental and environmental way. So how do you see that entering into the discussion with from the SME and scale-up perspective?
I think this is one of the questions that we're bringing up to startups and scale-ups as we're talking about what it means for good AI, bad AI regulation in the States, and what do you need, or states in the UK, and what do you need? It's such a hard question, and everybody's answer is always so slightly different. And I think we saw this with social media when it came to social media addiction, and you saw this when it came to privacy with like how much is too far. It's a conversation that we're trying to figure out what startups and scale-ups want, and we're trying to figure out what they're thinking about and where their level of comfort is on this topic, because it anytime we move more digitally, I feel like this is the question that comes up. Like, we had this come up when the internet came out. We had this come up when we like went to video games. We had this come up when we did VHS. Same thing with like social media. Then again with TikTok, which was a very specific social media. It's such a conversation every single time. And it is, I don't have an answer. I don't even have an answer in my personal life on how I feel about this. It's so, every single time I think about it, my brain just gets so confused and upset and happy all at the exact same time. And that's why we're mapping this out with the startups and the scale-ups, because every single time it's going to be a different answer, and it's going to be a wild range of both concrete objective thought and not objective feeling and emotion and raw energy when it comes to this. So yeah, I mean, important question. We're trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and perhaps there's more now of an imperative for this, given the effects of climate change that we're seeing, and the research that's out in terms of the compute power issue of these humongous systems that they necessitate, and the carbon footprint resulting from that. And so I'm sure maybe, I mean, just sort of, if you have thoughts on this in terms, have you been seeing this from the investor side in terms of adding this as part of the SDGs in regards to ensuring that, you know, investment is going to happen if there's actual delineation from the SME's perspective, clear delineation of ensuring that the technology actually has the creators, the developers have thought about this particular question.
I will say, I don't know if we've seen that from either side. I haven't had that conversation, or had gone that far into this conversation with regards to investors.
Okay, so Sid, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Not really, but a question that keeps me very kind of, bothered really, is the fact that the UK is, there's a lot that's happening on the governance of foundational and LLMs, through the foundational model task force that was, established recently. The House of Lords, for example, I think last month launched an inquiry into large language models as well. And of course, there is a lot of excitement within the startup community as well when it comes to generative AI and, foundation models. What is, your wish list, if I may, in terms of regulation that could underpin maybe, the initial governance approach for LLMs and foundation models in the UK context? What do you think startups would want? Is there, any chance of, a copy paste from the EU, given that, they've been first movers and shakers in the space, or do you think there's a need for another approach altogether?
I think foundation models are just one of so many types of AI and AI technologies that it's almost inherent that we talk about them as their own conversation and also part of the greater conversation. A great way I've been thinking about this is, if we were to only regulate generative AI, how many other types of AI would just be profoundly confused with how to comply? So I understand that the EU's added it into their foundation models text, and I think it's important we talk about them in regards to the AI Act. I also am really worried that a framework that focuses on them so specifically won't recognize or talk about or discuss all of the other amazing AI out there. The recent work on healthcare tech for AI and tech for reducing carbon emissions, that's going to be vastly different than the conversation we're having on generative AI. It's part of the reason an adaptive and proportionate approach that came out in the white paper sounded so exciting, and seeing a foundation models task force sounded so exciting. It's the conversation splitting up so that we're not being like generative AI, here's how we regulate AI, and then it affects all AI. It's really exciting to see us talk about these as different conversations. I don't know if that necessarily means its own regulation.
So right as we're now about to close, and I'm just going to make one final announcement in terms of our next upcoming policy hour. But before I change back to the screen, Kier, any, let's say, one sentence final thought, sort of take home message now that everybody's listening that you wanted to share?
We at the Startup Coalition are working on mapping and figuring out what it means to talk about both the bread and butter issues, but also the generative AI issues and the existential issues in the greater ecosystem. We're so keen to talk to startups, investors, and thought leaders on what comes next and what AI and AI regulation means, both for the ecosystem, but the greater economic future of the UK. So if there's anyone out there who wants to chat about it, talk about what's happening specifically in your neck of AI, happy to talk about it. We're really excited to have these conversations, get forth on figuring out what good looks like.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Akir, and also Sid, for our wonderful conversation. I want to say thank you to everybody for coming and joining us in this Policy Hour webinar. You're going to be receiving an email recap from this webinar. But before you go, I just want to give this announcement that our next Policy Hour will be on Thursday, August 31st at 3 p.m. BST, as you can see here on the screen, and we'll be talking about AI regulation around the world. So that includes talking about the different updates of recent activity that's happening in the UK, of course, but as well in the United States, in the EU, China, and beyond, and how all of this is coming together and where we're heading in the very near future. So please do check out our social media and our newsletter in the coming days. And of course, the email that you will be receiving, the recap of today, so that you can sign up. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kier, for being there with us.
Thank you so much for having me and for dealing with my hay fever through this all.
Oh, not at all.
No problem.